Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at what happens when ROG decides that they're going to go all out for an LN2 world record breaking motherboard. Which obviously means we're taking a look at the Maximus IX Apex because, well, I think we've already seen what it looks like, and we've heard what it's going to do, and we've seen the world records it's already broken. It's smashed several of them, pretty much on KB Lake launch day or in launch week of KB Lake. So today we're going to get to take a chance at what, perfection for LN2 overclockers looks like, at least according to the ASUS R&D team. So down here we have the Maximus IX Apex, and first thing you probably will notice is that there's only 3 memory slots, and they also very kindly put my name on this one. So that's pretty awesome, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with having my name engraved onto a motherboard, because I did not do that for myself. It did come like that. So where to start? I guess the I/O. I/O is sort of stripped down compared to what you'd see on some other Z270 motherboards. And the reason for that is, of course, that this board is meant for overclocking and not really meant for much else. So you get 2 buttons right here, one for BIOS flashback, one to reset the system. Next to that, you find 2 PS/2 ports, one for your mouse and one for your keyboard, because believe it or not, USB actually harms stability when overclocking. Admittedly, only significantly does that when you're doing something like really high BCLK frequency, where with really high BCLK frequency overclocks, you end up in situations where every hard drive you have on the system causes instability, every USB stick you plug in causes instability, every mouse, keyboard, and anything else you really plug in will cause further instability. So these PS/2 ports are obviously there on the motherboard to help in those overclocking scenarios. Next to that, you find an HDMI port and a display port, because KB Lake does have integrated graphics. Then 2 USB 3 ports, 4 USB 3 ports, and finally you find an Ethernet controller, Ethernet port, and I do believe that's a USB 2 port over there, as well as a USB, actually that might be a 3.1, and then there's a 3.1 Type-C under that. And then you also get your rear audio outputs, which I do believe include a digital out. So, I'm kind of sad that there's not a USB 2 port on the back of the board, only USB 3.0, because I don't have any PS/2 devices, and USB 2.0 is really useful when installing things like Windows 7, which doesn't have native USB 3 support, and especially if you're working on on Windows XP, because that doesn't have USB 3 support pretty much at all. And some people might be wondering, why on earth would you need Windows XP? Well, Windows XP is currently the only operating system that is viable for SuperPi 32 million and 1 million world records, because on Windows XP, SuperPi just runs faster, as well as there's some special tweaks that you can't do on newer operating systems. Also, Windows XP runs on a lot less RAM, which further increases, helps with stability a little bit when you're pushing really, really high memory overclocks, which you would be for SuperPi 32 million, because that benchmark is pretty much a pure CPU and memory benchmark. So Windows XP all the way, and this I/O selection reflects that with the PS/2 ports. Unfortunately, the lack of 2.0 kind of kills the board for me, because I don't have any PS/2 devices, though that shouldn't be hard to acquire, since they're going to be, obviously, since they are outdated and therefore very, very cheap. So, going around the board, I guess the first thing is going to be that we have 2 8-pin power connectors for the CPU. Both do not need to be plugged in for the board to function. You don't even really need both of them if you're doing LN2 overclocking. It's just very likely that if you do use both of them, you're going to have better voltage stability coming from the PSU during, power spikes on the CPU going from idle to load. So it can help out with overclocking on the extreme end, but generally it shouldn't really help that much. This might be something we test, where I'm going to see how high clocks I can get with only one of these plugged in versus two of these plugged in, say, Cinebench or XTU or some other heavy multi-threaded benchmark, because generally speaking, this one of these 8 pins should be plenty for a KB Lake CPU, even if it is heavily overclocked. Moving on, we have the VRM heatsink. This will be coming off because, well, this channel sort of specializes on VRM, VRM details, so we will be having a look under that, though I won't be able to pull up any data sheets right now. The computer is rather far away, and therefore so is Google. Though I do not expect ASUS to be using any components that I haven't seen before. I very strongly suspect that this is going to just be full international rectifier VRM setup. So, moving on further, we get to the 2 DDR4 memory slots and this third seemingly DDR4 memory slot, but this is actually a slot for a sort of expansion card that ASUS includes with the motherboard, which then houses your 2 M.2 SSDs. I don't really care much about M.2, so yeah, it exists. And apparently it supports things like RAID and stuff, but I am not going to be testing it, and I don't even have any devices to test it with if I wanted to. On the other hand, the 2 DDR4 memory slots are a really welcome, decision from ASUS, as that is pretty much, tells you exactly how much ASUS cares about overclocking on this motherboard. 2 memory slots means that it is much easier for the motherboard designers to route the memory data traces to the CPU, because you don't have to route all the extra traces for 2 extra slots. The other thing is, this is physically a lot shorter distance for this outer slot to the CPU, because normally if we actually had 4 memory slots right here, this gray slot right here would be all the way out where this black one is, and this gray one would be shifted 1 slot over, which basically means that if you wanted to make all your trace lengths equal across all 4 memory slots, you are limited to making all your traces as long as you need them for this outer slot, which, longer traces are more susceptible to interference, and therefore lower your overclocking stability. That's why in some situations on, say, the Z170 platform, the Maximus 8 Impact is actually slightly better at memory overclocking than the Maximus 8 Extreme, because the Impact has 2 memory slots instead of 4. This thing only has 2 DDR4 memory slots, so this will be an absolute beast for memory overclocking, and it's also rated to support up to 4266 out of the box, but it's been taken way beyond that already by overclockers, and it's like the overclocks that have been done so far on this board have been very, very interesting in terms of just how ridiculously high memory settings this thing is capable of running. And I remember seeing things like 4200, 12, 12, 12, as well as 4200. I think there might be a submission out there with 4200, 12, 11, 11, which is very, very, very difficult to do on DDR4, as you need very well binned kits, but you also need a board that is able to support those kinds of speeds, as well as a CPU that's capable of supporting those kinds of speeds. So yeah, it's for a lot of people this might be an interesting design decision, but for overclockers this is exactly what they're looking for in terms of the memory slots. So moving on, we get to the overclocker sort of zone of goodies to press and push when overclocking. First things first, we got a power on button, reset button, as well as a retry, and there's a dim.2 button that's for the extra M.2 SSD slot over there. The retry button basically quickly restarts the entire motherboard, drains it of power, and quickly restarts with the same settings you had. Very useful when you're trying to get very high memory overclocks to work, because sometimes just quickly rebooting the system over and over and over again gets the memory to train properly, and then it starts working. So, that's a nice, useful feature to have. Then we, of course, have the postcode, as well as a whole host of switches, including slow mode, next to which we have pause. Slow mode basically puts your CPU at lowest possible clocks. Pause, I have no idea. And the third switch is RSVD. The RSVD switch is basically what it does is it's supposed to remove cold boot bugs on CPUs. So a cold boot bug is when you're under LN2 and the CPU refuses to boot up at a certain temperature, but runs below that temperature just fine, which isn't really that uncommon on Skylake and Kaby Lake. Skylake and Kaby Lake CPUs commonly can run at minus 196 degrees centigrade, even minus, so a lot of overclockers will run them around minus 180 or whatever the limitations of their LN2 pot are, because obviously depending on the design of the LN2 pot, you can't always get minus 196. But the problem is with Kaby Lake and Skylake, if you crash at minus 196, you're probably going to have to heat the CPU back up to, say, minus 120 degrees before you get the system to boot. That is a lot of wasted time. First, you have to wait for the system to come back up in temperature, and then you have to cool it back down again once it's started. So the RSVD switch loads up a set of settings into the BIOS, which in theory should get 80 or 90% of all CPUs to boot up at minus 196, regardless of everything else. So, very useful. And if this switch doesn't get the CPU booting at very, very, very low temperatures, you can, of course, go into the BIOS and fine-tune a few voltages yourself, and those should, in theory, help you remove the cold bugs. But again, no guarantees. You might just have a CPU that cold bugs regardless of what you do. So, below those switches, we get even more switches, this time for the PCIe slots. So, we do have 4 PCIe slots on here, so in theory, you could cram 8 graphics cards on here. I mean, 4 graphics cards, or 8 GPU cores. There are dual GPU cards, of course. So, if you do want to run, say, LN2 to 4-way GPUs, or really any number of GPUs on LN2, or water cooling, or even air cooling, you can use these switches to disable PCIe slots, which is very useful if one of your GPUs is misbehaving and you're having a hard time figuring out which one it is. So, one of the GPUs just is refusing to boot. So you can disable that GPU, boot the system, and figure out, well, yeah, that's the one that's not working, and choose to replace that one. So very useful if you have a water cooling loop, and, for those, replacing GPUs in a 4-way water-cooled setup is a massive pain. On LN2, of course, it means you don't have to pull out GPUs either, which, even if you're running something like 2-way, would be a kind of a pain to do. If you're running 4-way on LN2, it is ridiculously hard to swap GPUs, so that is a very, very welcome addition. In terms of actual multi-GPU configurations you can run on this board, you can't run 4-way SLI in terms of 4 cards in 4 slots. You could, in theory, put 2 Titan Zs on this, or some other dual GPU card from NVIDIA, like, say, the GTX 590 or 690, and run 4-way through these 2 slots, but you can't run 4 different GPUs from NVIDIA on here in SLI, because SLI doesn't support being run on anything less than an ATEX slot, and the only 2 ATEX slots you get here are this one and this one. On the other hand, with Crossfire, you can run 4 GPUs in 4 slots in Crossfire here. They will run at X8, I do believe. Yep, so X8, X4, 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 which sounds like not enough bandwidth, but Crossfire actually handles low PCIe bandwidth more or less just fine. It doesn't have a huge impact on your scores, so it is possible to run a 4-way setup off of this motherboard, and I do intend to run a 4-way setup on this motherboard. I have my 4th, well, actually now it's my 5th GPU from the Fiji lineup coming, but, well, one of them obviously doesn't work, but I will be running a 4-way Fury setup off of this motherboard, trying to get a really high score for Unigine Heaven. And, this is just the perfect board to do that on, because Unigine Heaven is all about, I do believe it's a 4-core benchmark. It doesn't really scale with many cores, so there's no reason to run it on X99, whereas it does need very high CPU frequency, and Kaby Lake is hitting, upwards of 6.5 gigahertz pretty consistently on just about any benchmark. So this motherboard is perfect for that record attempt. Well, it's not really a record, score attempt, I guess. So moving on further, we get 2 jumpers, this time for your memory slots. And I should have checked the manual before I started doing this video, but I didn't think they'd cram that many more new features on here. Anyway, I expect one of these to disable one of your memory slots for the same reason that you have the PCIe switches. If one of your memory sticks is misbehaving, you can try disabling it, and if the system starts up, well, it's that memory stick that you're having issues with. Then we get the 24-pin connector, and over here we get a MEMOK button. This right here will boot up the system wiping all of your memory-related settings. It'll basically reset all your memory settings to a safe setting that'll definitely boot. Very nice if you don't want to necessarily remove all of your CPU settings, but if you're doing something like BCLK overclocking and tweaking a lot of voltages at the same time, this will probably still lose most of your settings anyway. But if you're just, if you're only tweaking vCore and core clock for your CPU OC and only enabling XMP or something and it fails to post, pressing that button will, get you back up and running from where you left off. We then get a Molex power connector to supply extra power to the PCIe slots if you, run something like 3-way or 4-way or even 2-way if you have GPUs that pull a little too much power from the PCIe slots, because surprisingly enough, PCIe slots are way, way more capable of handling a lot of power than the 24-pin. If generally, if you're overclocking 4-way or 3-way, the problem is not your PCIe slots or the power plane of the motherboard going up in flames, it's the 24 pins 12-volt lines burning out. So that Molex connector right there is very useful for multi-GPU setups. Then we get a angled USB 3.0 port. This is very welcome, and thanks to this cutout along the motherboard as well, it is actually really easy to route your cables around here because, well, you have more space to work with. So yeah, very nice that this is angled like that. And then we get the SATA ports. There's only 4 of them on this board, which is a lot less than all the other motherboards. But again, this is an motherboard for extreme overclockers, and less SATA ports does improve stability when doing things like heavy BCLK overclocking, or really, if you're really unfortunate, sometimes it'll help even with normal, CPU and memory overclocking. So less SATA ports really isn't a downside on this board, especially with what it's aimed for. So, moving further on downward, we get a bunch of jumpers to control your LEDs on the motherboard, because this thing does come with Aura RGB. Of course it does. 2017 is the year of RGB. Well, actually, I think 2016 was the start of the year of RGB. So this is 2017 year of RGB sequel. Moving on, below that we get... there's a missing OC button header. Under that we get 2 sensor plugs, which I think are for temperature sensors. I should have checked the motherboard manual about that. Then we get what seems to be, that seems to be a pump header. Next to that, an LED, another LED header, another fan header, speaker header. Ooh, this is really cool. Yeah, so front panel audio is actually routed to the front here, as well as you get a speaker header, so for the debug speaker, because there's not one present directly on the board. If you have a speaker and you want to hear BP codes instead of using the very useful post code, you can plug that in right there, and that'll beep at you, and then of course you have the front panel header right next under that. Down here, red button, BIOS switch. Board comes with dual BIOS capabilities. If you mess up one of your BIOS flashes, you can just press that, and you'll be on a good BIOS, recover the dead BIOS, and then try flash again. So that's very, very nice failsafe over here. You also get the CMOS battery right here, so if for some reason the clear CMOS button or header, now I'm not sure which one they included, but if either of those doesn't work, you can just pull the CMOS battery, and due to its position, this will be actually pretty easy to access, as in a single GPU or 2 GPU setup, you still, this isn't going to be crammed right under the GPUs, so you won't have to pull them out to get at that. In a 4-way setup, well, in 4-way setups, everything sucks, including the operating system experience. Moving along, we get fan header. Is that a USB, what? Some kind of USB, oh no, that's the ROG extension. So this is for the ROG panel header right there. Then you get 2 USB 2.0 ports, well, USB 2.0 headers, and then we get another cutout because there's nothing important here. Fan header, LED RGB header, trusted platform module header, and some kind of audio header. The audio section is, again, stripped down because this is an extreme overclocking motherboard. And if you're doing extreme overclocking, well, you probably won't be listening to the music from the system that you're overclocking, because every time it crashes, it's going to give you a very pleasant buzz. Or some other horrific, you know, looped noise effect. So audio is kind of optional. So yeah, that sort of sums up all of the, you know, on the surface features, and let's try pull that heatsink off, which brings us to my first complaint about this here motherboard, which is I have no idea why they went with the mounting system they went with for the heatsinks. As you can see, these are some kind of hex screws, because apparently Phillips is too good for them, or something like that. I really have no idea. Hopefully this will come out, but with how it looks on the back of the board, which you can't really see, that's going to be a bit difficult. Yeah, that's really my biggest complaint about this board right now. I haven't used it yet, so... And it's going to be a while before I get to use it, because my i7... Yeah, there's other things I'm worried about than getting an i7 right now, so unfortunately, I don't have a Kaby Lake CPU yet. I will have one in time to test this motherboard. Yeah, okay, they are just screws going all the way through the board. Kind of annoyed with that. And the reason being is that it makes it way more difficult to tear the board apart than if they just used Phillips heads with like spring-loaded screws, or even not spring-loaded screws, on the back of the board. That would be a lot easier to work with, in my opinion, but hey. Of all the complaints to have, complaining about screws being too not user-friendly enough is probably the least of this board. Is actually quite the achievement. Of course, once we pull that heatsink off, I might start complaining about their VRM component selection. Then it'll get worse. But I doubt that. I already checked what driver ICs they are using, and they are using all international rectifier ICs. So the voltage controller is almost certainly going to be another international rectifier voltage controller, which, if you've seen any of my other VRM breakdown videos for GPUs, or even, I actually don't think I've done any motherboards, then you know that International Rectifier is one of the best manufacturers for voltage controllers out there. Of course, International Rectifier is now part of Infineon. So, yeah, but the International Rectifier brand name still exists, so same deal to me. And that is the board heatsink coming off. That really wasn't that bad, but still, I'd prefer Phillips. And there we have the VRM. And let's see. This'll be interesting. So that is a surprise. I thought they would be using fully integrated power IR stages, but, well, they were using driver FETs on the back, so I probably shouldn't be that surprised. Let's see what these are. Can't read them. Damn it. Lighting. Gotta be kidding me. Oh, there we go. And that's a component I've never seen before. Either way, let's see how many... The voltage controller. And the voltage controller is a rebranded DigiPlus EPU from ASUS. So that's nice. And it does look like they crammed another VRM down here, so I'll have to pull that off as well. And I doubt I'll have any idea what that's made up of, because that's a minor VRM. That's assuming I can even get it to come off. Is that not screwed in? How on earth? Let's see, what does it say? Man, those are hard to read. Oh well, when I do the full review of this board, I'll cover what those are made of. At least these shields come off a lot easier than the heatsink does, which is probably because they want you to be able to, swap them out, since that one's there. And I'll probably not put this one back on, just because when I insulate the board, there's no reason to have that one in place afterwards, as I doubt it will actually be a functional heatsink, since that's usually, this one's just sort of floating there to look pretty. unlike this one, which actually has to cool the VRM. Kinda. Because Kaby Lake CPUs are so low power that cooling the VRM tends to be optional, especially on the more high-end motherboards. And yeah, I was right. This is just a piece of plastic, which isn't really that surprising and not disappointing either. And there we get another VRM with another ton of voltage with a... Okay, yeah. So we have 4C 09 and a 4C... Yeah, so there's two 4C09s as well as a 4C06 B. So those are on semiconductor. Yeah, those are on semiconductor MOSFETs. So that one of these voltages is going to be VCCSA. The other is going to be VCCIO. For now, I don't know which one's which. I'll probably check that with a multimeter later. This right here seems to be a fully integrated. This looks like a power stage, right there. That looks like a power stage IC, and that's going to be for the other phase. So, yeah, and there's actually, this should be a voltage controller right here. That component right there should be voltage controller, and that should be the other voltage controller. So this is going to be interesting if I can read any of them. And I can't. Of course I can't, because that would make my life too easy. So unfortunately, you're going to have to wait for you're going to have to wait for the full review of the motherboard where there will be a fully labeled VRM diagram. So... yeah, but as far as I can tell from right now, it doesn't seem like they've done, it's Kaby Lake. Even if they used really, really low-end parts, there wouldn't really be a power issue. And, they did use international rectifier drivers, and that's an international rectifier voltage controller, just rebranded, or at least it should be. And if that's the case, then this VRM already... with how much international rectifier controllers and drivers cost, this VRM is not going to be cheaping out on the MOSFETs. And these two down here are very, very minor in terms of power requirements, so, they don't really matter regardless of what they do. But the 4C09 and the C06, I think I've seen those before. They're really not that, actually they might be well, this pairing of MOSFETs, I've seen those model numbers before. Off the top of my head, I'm going to say they're overkill for... They're plenty of power for that voltage. They're probably overkill. And then, of course, the memory VRM is 2 phases, and I'm going to have to look up the data sheets for that one, too. So, yeah, that sort of covers the quick look around the board. I guess most of you will want to know if this is a... Actually, yeah, I can tell you the phase count right now because luckily ASUS has just about made a you can see the power planes of this board. I'm not sure if it shows up on camera, but I can see them in person. And these two phases right here are going to be for the CPU iGPU. So this inductor, that inductor, that's your iGPU. And then this entire area right here, this sort of L shape of inductors, that's going to be your V-core. So that's 8 phases right there. So that's 8 plus 2. Let's see, is there any doubling ICs? I see none on the back. I see 0 on the front. So, well, I don't really see 0. I need to check what that is. But it does look like ASUS opted for a true 8-phase VRM design for the V-core, and then the 2 phases, they're true, of course. Nobody doubles up a 2-phase. There's no point. So, yeah. True 8 phases VRM, that's one of the best options for VRM. That is the highest phased count you can achieve without using a doubling scheme because they don't make voltage controllers with more than 8 phases. So, there's no complaints there from me. That's exactly what I sort of wanted to see. A true 8-phase VRM on a really high-end overclocking board is pretty much the best you can hope for. The next step up would be a 16 or a 32, and those would be ridiculous overkill for a mere Kaby Lake CPU. So yeah, that covers everything I can cover right now about this board. There will be obviously more coverage of the board in the future, There will be a full review of the board going up on my blog, including some overclocking results. I unfortunately do not have any really high-end DDR4, just because I'm not really a fan of benchmarks that need good memory settings. So the memory part of the review is going to be, you know, I'm somewhat subpar in my opinion, just because I can't really do much about that. But, you know, it should still cover at least how the board behaves in terms of overclocking. Is it hard to work with, easy to work with, that kind of thing. And I will be doing live streams on the board because this is the most powerful single core and 4-core platform you can work with. So I do intend to do at least one session with the CPU on LN2 for doing things like Cinebench, SuperPi 32 million, 1 million. Obviously, SuperPi 32 million will be a disaster because I refuse to use Windows XP, as well as just not having RAM for SuperPi 32 million. But, you know, it's still a doable benchmark if you throw enough gigahertz at it. And then for more interesting things, I'm going to be doing a 4-way Fiji GPU setup and a 3-way setup where the CPU will be on the LN2. The GPUs will be on water cooling and air cooling, so there'll be 2 Fury X's, a Fury, and another Fury down here, and that'll be a 4-way setup trying to get the highest score for 4 GPU units in heaven. That is, in terms of actually getting those things done, expect to see them sometime next month, because as of right now, I have no Kaby Lake CPUs on hand to use, though that is going to be sorted next month, obviously, or at least it should be sorted next month. And if it isn't sorted by next month, I might end up having to buy one. So, yeah, that's that. I don't really think there's anything else to cover. My hair obviously hasn't managed to stand up that long. There we go, it's back up. And yeah, that's that. So, drop a comment down below about everything you didn't like in this video, or drop a comment down below about everything you did like in this video, or ask any random overclocking question you want to have answered. I might get around to actually picking it up and answering it. There is a subscribe button for those of you who haven't used it, and for those of you who have used the subscribe button, there is a bell button somewhere. I know it's on the channel page. I don't know if it's down under the video. But you can press that, and then you'll get spammed about every single thing that ever happens on this channel, including, like, I think me liking videos might be included. Me posting comments should be. Me posting, yeah, basically you'll get notified about anything directly via email. If you would like to support what I do here at Actually Hardcore Overclocking, then, you know, I have a Patreon, and I do now have a working PayPal again. So that all works, and you will find a link to the Patreon down in the description, and a email to, you know, donate to on the page where that link actually leads to, if you do not want to use the Patreon system, though I do believe they should be rolling out one-time donations eventually. So, yeah, that's that for this video, and see you guys next time. I need to pause this. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Come on, why now? I can't believe it. Oh, there we go, it's back. Yeah, I use a Razer Naga because I've always used a Razer Naga, and I really like Razer Nagas. Unfortunately, Razer's drivers are worse than I remember them ever being, so yeah. Now, this time, actually, see ya.